Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and in the next hour, we're going to be talking with Tim Keller. His book, A Hope in Times of Fear, is certainly one that he has both from an experiential point of view, having pancreatic cancer, and even before that, if you might remember back in, I think, in 2002, he had thyroid cancer, so he has certainly been a cancer survivor and dealing with what looks like maybe even a death sentence, so we'll talk about that, but he also is broadening it to all of us, dealing with the pandemic, the lockdown, and much more. So we're going to spend about half an hour with him an hour from now. And then 2 hours from now, we will have Judge Ken Starr with us. We'll be talking about his new book, Religious Liberty in Crisis, individual that has argued 36 cases before the Supreme Court. He's been Solicitor General. He has served as a circuit court judge. He's been in the academic world. He's been at Baylor Law School and Baylor and all sorts of things, Pepperdine Law School. So we'll have certainly enjoy that conversation, even though it will be airing 2 hours from now. And for those of you that listen to this on radio, you won't be able to hear, but you can listen to it online. I think if it turns out to be so good, maybe we'll play it at the new hour in the future. So again, those are just a few people we'll be talking about today. And you might say, well, that's pretty much of a star-studded cast. Well, we have a pretty good week. We have Jerry Jenkins with us. Later in this week, we'll be talking about his book, The Chosen, which is based upon the TV series that his son Dallas Jenkins has done. We have Michael Yosef, and his new book is out. As a matter of fact, I was in Barnes & Noble yesterday and saw the book. So again, just a great opportunity to hear from all sorts of other individuals, and those are just some of the notables that we will be talking about all week. So I hope you join us every single day. This first hour, we oftentimes have a lot more people listening in the state of Texas, and so if you're in Texas, certainly listen up. But even if you're not, most of what we'll talk about in the next hour relates to everything in the rest of the country as well. But I thought I'd start out for just a minute with our first article by Nicholas Kerr. He is a scholar with the Lone Star Policy Institute, and he points out that, of course, last week we had the governor of the state of Texas, Greg Abbott, actually saying that the statewide mask mandate and all the restrictions on businesses would be lifted this week. And, of course, that led almost immediately to the president, that would be Joe Biden, calling these decisions Neanderthal thinking. Well, Nicholas Kerr at the very end says it's not Neanderthal thinking, it's enlightened thinking. So let's get his argument. And wherever you come down on the mask mandates and the vaccines and all the rest, I think he's got some really good points here, because he says in making his announcement, Governor Abbott focused on the fact that Texans have mastered individual habits and practices to mitigate against the risk of contracting the coronavirus. In addition, the state has already protected a majority of the most vulnerable citizens. Last night, I saw an interview with the lieutenant governor, Dan Patrick, in which he was pointing that out as well. Any seniors not already vaccinated will have access to one certainly by the end of this month. And Texas now has therapeutic drugs that are mitigating the risk of pandemic deaths and hospitalizations. And so, again, Nicholas Kerr says, look, at its core, this decision is about personal responsibility and the importance of letting residents weigh health risks against other risks inherent to their lives. And so then he goes on to say that while the state mandates are to be lifted on Wednesday, He also points out that businesses and people in areas that have higher case loads are retaining mask requirements and other sensible precautions. He said, for example, within hours of the governor's decision, we received notices, he said, from our Dallas school and local businesses letting us know that there is no immediate change in the way they operate. This is as it should be, he says, and what we anticipated given how hard our city has been hit by the virus. So again, I assume he's living in the Dallas area. He goes on to say that, but at the same time, it seemed appropriate that small towns and counties in this largest state in the continental United States, some of which have not had one single virus fatality, should be able to return to normal. And that is, of course, the difficulty when you're talking about a state as vast geographically as the state of Texas. There are a lot of different kinds of scenarios. A one-size-fits-all answer from the federal government has never worked very well. But even, frankly, a one-size-fits-all mandate for the entire state of Texas, which, quite frankly, is larger than many countries in Europe, maybe doesn't as well. And so he's pointing out that, if you live in a small town, or even if you're in one of these counties where, by definition, social distancing is the norm, just think about this for a minute, then, those kinds of situations are very different than Houston and Dallas and San Antonio. So I think I've got a good point there. A couple more points he'll make, and then we'll move on to some others. He says, meanwhile, he's trying to bring out the other issue. I've skipped over a paragraph or two in which he says children in other states are entering into an entire year with no in-person schooling despite being at low risk from the virus. I mean, how many times have we talked about that? Penna-Dexter's done commentaries on it. I've done commentaries on it. It surfaces so often in our weekend edition. And he says substantial learning loss is predicted and mental health issues are, of course, skyrocketing. The McKinsey and Company estimates that by June, children will have lost up to 9 months in learning mathematics. And I think that's a low number myself, but okay. Much like the extinction fate of the Neanderthals, small businesses by the thousands are closing permanently, meaning livelihoods are being ruined. Just the other day, drove by another restaurant that was closed, and I was just reading the other day about this one particular theater chain in Austin that said they're going to reject the removal of the mask mandate by the governor. And then somebody points out, and then the next day they filed for bankruptcy because they couldn't simply even keep in business for that long. So there are consequences, as we've talked about before, especially with these lockdowns. But again, Nicholas Kerr stops by saying Abbott made his priorities clear, stating we are ensuring that all businesses and families in Texas have the freedom to determine their own destiny. And Nicholas Kerr says, this is not Neanderthal thinking, it's enlightened thinking. So anyway, that's kind of his thought. It's the first article. I skipped over a little bit of it just to give you a sense of one of the reactions from an individual who is looking at that in terms of the entire state, recognizing that it certainly makes sense to keep some of the mandates in certain businesses and certain cities, but at the same time, Texas is a really big state. And if you don't think so, get in a car sometime and drive from one end to the other. I have some friends that decided, this was sort of interesting, that they would start in Texarkana and ride their bike from Texarkana all the way to El Paso. They did it during the Thanksgiving break a couple of years ago. Actually, they started early because you can't do that in just a few days. And you realize how big this state is and how, in some respects, a universal mask mandate or a variety of other things certainly makes sense in some localities, in some circumstances, but maybe not all. So that's his argument. But we come back. Let me, for another few minutes, focus on Texas, but compare it to Florida. There are a lot of people that are saying now that the governor, Greg Abbott, should actually follow the lead of another governor, Ron DeSantis, not just on the issue of masks, but on election integrity. Some people have evaluated how much do we really need in the state of Texas, and we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Last year, Amazon began removing books that gatekeepers felt took the wrong side of the ongoing LGBTQ debate. Some of them weren't the sort of books most small bookstores would deem to have on their shelves because of their mean-spirited tone. Then came Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. When I interviewed her on the book 3 months ago, we talked about some of the negative controversy that resulted in Target pulling the book off the shelves, but you could still buy the book on Amazon. That is no longer the case with Dr. Ryan Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. Amazon pulled the book, even though the book was released 3 years ago. Why now? Some speculate it was an inconvenient reminder of the dangers posed if Congress passed the Equality Act. If you read the book, you will find an accurate presentation of scientific, medical, and legal debates about transgenderism. Anderson currently serves as the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. It would be hard to describe him as a bomb-throwing radical, though he obviously has a viewpoint that comports with a biblical view of marriage and family. Critics of Amazon usually focus on its size and market share. There's another problem, its opacity. We still do not know who decided to ban the book or why the Amazon gatekeepers even felt the need to ban the book. Removing books from Amazon has larger implications. First, it also removes them from Amazon subsidiaries like Kindle, Audible, and A-Books. Second, it sends a signal to other bookstores not to carry the book. Here's the issue. Censorship makes it easier to maintain that there is only one side to an argument when one of the sides is no longer given a forum. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can, for just a minute, answer a question that people are asking, and that is, can we in the state of Texas, or can other states for that matter, if you're listening from another state, learn some lessons from Florida? The lesson that you can learn from Florida is that 2 decades ago, when we had such a disaster in Florida, there were a number of governors, and the most recent one being Ron DeSantis, but we'll give credit to other governors even before them, both Democrat and Republican, said, we got to fix this in Florida, and if we don't, we're going to be a laughingstock again. And, of course, there was no problem this time in Florida. Matter of fact, we had Eric Eggers on, and he said, I'm glad that my home state of Florida this time, who was a disaster back in the 2000 election, was not a disaster in the 2020 election. So the question that you can ask is there something that Texas can learn from Florida, either what they've done in the past or what they are recommending now currently? Aaron Anderson, in the second piece that I have here, by the way, Aaron Anderson actually works with Texas Scorecard, no relation, but nevertheless has looked at the fact that the governor, Greg Abbott, has said that election integrity is a top priority. And because it's considered an emergency priority, what's so intriguing about this is that means that the bills could be actually addressed right now or even fast-tracked, whereas there is a regulation, we won't get into all the details, there's a constitutional stipulation that for the first month or so you can't even vote on or consider some of the legislation, you just simply file them. So a lot of people say, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, you haven't really at this point said which particular pieces of legislation you might endorse. which is his prerogative. Maybe you could learn from Florida and the governor there, Ron DeSantis, about what he's proposed in legislation. And so the governor there in Florida has proposed 10 specific election reform measures. And I'll give you the punchline before we get to the bottom line here. And the punchline is simply this. If you go through and look at what is being recommended, the good news is Texas has done much of it. That's why we don't seem to have as much controversy about election fraud. Although I did point out last week, if you were listening, a judge that has been, and two of his cohorts, actually been arrested for 150 counts of election fraud. But those tend to be the exceptions. Fortunately, they're not the rule. And so let's, if we can, look at this. And a group called Direct Action Texas, which is looking at election integrity, looked at each one of those. I'm not going to go through all 10, but I'm going to give you a sense about the fact that if you wonder, are there some things we can do in Texas? There are a few, but the good news is Texas has done a good job. Now I wish many of those other states, we're talking about you, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, maybe even Arizona, a couple others, but nevertheless, look at these. First of all, one of the recommendations is to not use mail ballot drop boxes. Well, the good news is we don't use mail drop ballot boxes. And, of course, our friends at DAT, Direct Action Texas, said it should stay that way. What about mail-in balloting? Now, Texas did pass legislation to deal with this issue of ballot harvesting and mail balloting, harvesting, and all of the rest. But again, the argument is maybe they could do a little bit more in that regard. So maybe one of the pieces of legislation the governor might consider endorsing is to tightening up some of this mail ballot harvesting, which is legal in places like California, illegal in others. Matter of fact, it was so illegal in North Carolina, they had to redo a congressional election, if you're not familiar with that. Let's take another one. Mail ballot signature matches. Again, these are sort of straightforward, wouldn't you think? But again, Texas currently requires election officials to match signatures on mail-in ballots to verify voters' identities. And you might say, well, of course they do that. No, they don't. Not in other states, but they do here. And then another piece is that Texas, Florida, and Georgia are among states seeking to ban private third-party funding of government election offices, which could be one of the bigger issues there as well. So that's one that people are going to follow and look at, and maybe a tougher one to actually enact, because Mark Zuckerberg, who's, of course, the founder of Facebook, actually allocated $400 million in grant money through various left-wing nonprofits to select local election administrators and use the cash to target a get-out-the-vote initiative. So some of that might be a little bit tougher, but we'll watch and see what is happening right now. The chairman of the House Elections Committee is Representative Briscoe Cain, and we'll see what happens there. But overall, you can see some things where there's a need for maybe a 10,000-mile wheel alignment and a couple of others. But after I went through that long list, I was pretty impressed that most of the safeguards that need to be enacted in other states do exist here, and so that's good news. Which brings me to the action item that we've been talking about, and also one of the articles I've posted. The action item is on the website, pointofview.net. The article that I've posted comes from our friends at the Wall Street Journal. The editors call this Making Every Election Like 2020. They start out by saying, if you thought the 2020 election ran like a finely oiled machine, you'll love what the Democrats have planned now, because the Senate and House bills, that would be H.R. 1 and S1, for voting changes would make mail-in balloting and a plague year seem buttoned up. I love that line there. For example, H.R. 1, as we've pointed out before, is packed with provisions that would federalize election rules to all sorts of things, unsettle long-standing practices, end security austerity measures that local officials think are prudent undermine public confidence, they say, and increase the odds of contested elections. H.R. 1 would create a federal right to a mail ballot, no excuse necessary. Registered voters couldn't be made to submit any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot. No ID at all, except a signature or an affirmation. State laws requiring mail votes to be notarized or signed by witnesses would be removed, and late arriving ballots, if postmarked on time, would be valid nationwide up to 10 days after the election. Could possibly go wrong there. H.R. 1 would overrule, state laws against ballot harvesting, letting Americans nationwide designate any person to return a vote, provided the carrier does not receive any form of compensation based on the number of ballots. Also would not put a limit on how many voted and sealed absentee ballots any designated person could return. Again, if you think that that's safe, knock yourself out, but there are all sorts of problems associated with that. Under H.R. 1, again, I'm just reading from some of the pieces in this editorial, same-day voter registration and 15 days of early voting would both be mandatory. H.R. 1 also says felons couldn't be denied the ballot. So if you're a felon, you could vote, unless you're in prison. Okay, at that point, we maybe draw the line, but that's it. And unless you think this is all about election, I did not know this until I read down to the 4th page, and I encourage you to read this whole piece because it's amazing to me. H.R. 1 also would require the judiciary to create a code of conduct for Supreme Court justices. And the idea, you can see, is that then if the Supreme Court justices ever did jump into one of these election disputes, like they had to do in Gore versus Bush in 2000, then these ethics complaints could be enough to force many of them to recuse themselves. And so that's just another thing that you look at it and say, that really doesn't even have anything to do with elections, except indirectly maybe it does. And they point out, really, that's just one more issue because it's an 800-page bill, and lurking inside that bill are probably all sorts of other things that I'm sure many of us would find to be controversial. So, as we've mentioned before, since this particular piece of legislation has already passed the House, H.R. 1, and could not get one Republican vote for it, now it has ended up in the Senate. And interestingly enough, what you have is the For the People Act, which is now no longer H.R. 1, but S1, is there in the Senate. And so we are encouraging you to contact your 2 United States senators. You don't have to remember everything I mentioned, although the second article we've posted here is from the people at the Wall Street Journal talking about that. But if you click on the button that says Take Action, contact your senators, you'll see a great opportunity for you to put in your zip code. And once you do so, up pops your 2 United States senators. We have a suggested letter, but you can write it any way you would like. You can edit this or add some points along the way. And as soon as you fill out some of the general information so that they have your name and address and know that you're not just making this up or we're not some kind of bot, then you can click the button that says Submit, and you will have contacted your 2 United States senators. So I thought I'd mention that just at a time when we're talking about maybe some legislation that needs to be shored up here in the state of Texas. We have a real danger of a piece of federal legislation that could throw almost all of those safeguards out. And so that's why we encourage you to take some action. We're going to take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. About a half an hour from now, we're going to be talking with Timothy Keller. His new book is Hope in Times of Fear. And it really is the resurrection and meaning of Easter. So it's a good thing to actually get us thinking about Easter as we are getting closer to that and the resurrection day. But also it is based upon dealing with his own issues of first years ago having thyroid cancer, now more recently having pancreatic cancer, but also all of our experiences of going through the pandemic and the lockdown and some need for us to have real hope in the midst of some of the chaos. And so I think you'll appreciate that book. And then an hour and a half from now, we will have Ken Starr with us. We'll be talking about his book, Religious Liberty in Crisis. And it really is kind of a thorough look at this. You know, sometimes we look at different parts of that when we have Kelly Shackelford, Lathan Watts, Jeremy Dice, whoever it might be in studio. But here, kind of just look at the whole issue, everything from school prayer to equal access, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the Bladensburg Cross, even all the way down to his last chapter, chapter 13, on the cancel culture. I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation. Maybe one you might want to sit down and take some notes or maybe even listen to it again. If it turns out well, it might even want to make a CD available to some of our donors and play it once again for people to learn a little bit more about this issue of religious liberty. So that's a brief overview of what we're going to cover in the next 2.5 hours. If you would like to join us, of course, 1-800-351-1212. My third article is from Katie Pavlich. She says, a pandemic police state for you while illegal aliens go free. And I thought she kind of put two different issues together because sometimes it's important to do that. We sometimes see the irony of here a lockdown affecting all sorts of American citizens and making sure that they do not test positive for COVID-19. And then we have illegal aliens being allowed to go into the general population, many of whom actually have tested positive for the coronavirus. And if indeed, we talked earlier about this mask mandate, if indeed the number of cases go up, especially in the South Texas area, everybody in the press and all the Democrats will blame the governor, maybe even some Republicans will, for removing the mask mandate. And that may be part of the reason, but I suspect a good portion of it are the fact that we're just releasing people that we know are actually possible super spreaders of the disease. And so that's something to pay attention to. But Katie Pavlich starts out by saying, last summer, I went to and flew to Montana ahead of a week-long road trip through Yellowstone and Teton National Park. Ooh, I want to do that sometime. She said, when I landed in the airport in Bozeman, and I've been in Bozeman, Montana, it's been many years since there, she says, I was greeted by National Guard troops. After scanning my driver's license, taking my temperature, and answering a few questions, they allowed me to move along to baggage claim and my rental car. So that's in Bozeman, Montana, which is not the end of the world, but I would suggest, with all due respect to our friends in Bozeman, you can see it from there. There are some places further east of there that are just as wild and desolate as possible. Anyway, second paragraph, she says, in Washington, D.C. that same summer, I received text messages from a friend walking along the river. There she saw National Guard troops ensuring that people did not sit on benches and giving orders to pedestrians who weren't properly socially distancing outside. Then she says, a few months later, when I traveled to New York City for work, police officers met the passengers of our train at the top of the escalator at Penn Station and directed us to a table. We were forced to fill out paperwork about where we were staying, where we came from, and contact information. We were reminded of the mandatory 14-day quarantine period after traveling from out of state, threatened with hefty fines or jail for violations, and told a law enforcement official could show up at the address provided in order to ensure compliance. Essential workers were given an exemption but still encouraged to quarantine. And at this point, she says, all of this was unsettling. The implementation of a police state for American citizens was done in the name of preventing the spread, of course, of the coronavirus. Now, she says, 1 year into the pandemic and under a new president, we're learning that the Biden administration is allowing hundreds of illegal aliens who have tested positive for the disease to travel freely around the United States. This particular report comes from Fox News. She says, quote, more than 100 illegal immigrants released by the Border Patrol into Texas in late January have tested positive for the coronavirus following their arrival. They talk about one person who's a spokesperson for Brownsville who said that of the 108 positives, that represents, as I mentioned on this program the other day, 6.3% of the number of total migrants who have been rapid tested at the city's main bus station where they're being released by the Border Patrol. Rapid testing of the individuals began there on January 25th. By the way, I've looked enough to say that's one of the only times we have a test like that. Most of those individuals are released, but the one out of Brownsville where they actually took the time to test all of those individuals, they had 108 there at that one particular locale, and you can kind of estimate that from the fact that, what did we have the other day? We didn't have 1,000 crossing the border. We didn't have 2,000 crossing the border. We didn't have 3,000 crossing the border. I had erroneously said it was 4,000. Well, that was 4,700, but that didn't count those who were seen crossing but not detained and those who were detained and returned. It actually was 6,000 people crossed in one day. Now, you can do the math, I hope. If you have 108 positives out of the people they picked up in Brownsville, and we had 6,000 come in. Now, to be fair, a good portion of them, about 900 were returned back to Mexico, but all the rest came in. So it's about 5,000 in round numbers. You can estimate that 5,000 times, even if you take this low number as 6%, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individuals that are being released that are testing positive and are possible super spreaders. So I think her point's well taken, and I don't think you have to roll your eyes at some of the concerns she's raising because they're very valid concerns. Anyway, this is our third article, and I just thought I would skip ahead over all the other things she said, which are all very interesting, to her final paragraph in which she says, look, Americans haven't been able to visit family members for a year. Government travel restrictions have prevented family members overseas from visiting. Grandparents have been placed in solitary confinement without the comfort of loved ones. Americans have been threatened with fines and jail time for leaving their homes, and yet illegal aliens who cross the southern border are allowed to do what they please. Worse, government officials who have been proponents of lockdowns, like those working in the Biden administration, have no interest in applying the health standards they expect Americans to follow to illegal aliens traveling to different parts of the country. Dr. Fauci, who has been readily available for interviews and cover shoots for InStyle magazine, has nothing to say about this inevitable super spreader event. So if we are serious about this, it does seem to me that this article, I think, identifies a concern that doesn't seem to be getting much press and hardly is even mentioned by the administration itself. Well, let's move on to some other issues because right now Congress is considering some other pieces of legislation. You know, they've passed a COVID-19 relief bill in the Senate. Now it goes back to the House. Eventually it's going to be signed by the president. Of course, you've had the Equality Act pass the House of Representatives, and you've also had the For the People Act pass the House of Representatives. So let's now get to one that's going to be front and center this week because we have the trial for the police officer charged with the death of George Floyd, because the House of Representatives now is considering this bill. It's called the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2021. And the argument that is being made here by Jason Johnson, who is, interestingly enough, not really an advocate. He was simply the former deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department, and he has expressed his concern about the fact that what is happening right now is there's just a promotion of all sorts of myths about police. And his argument is promoting all these myths about police won't make it safer. And so as we are now going to be hearing quite a bit this week about what is called the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2021, although it doesn't necessarily call for the defunding of police, it will probably be a super spreader of myths about law enforcement. And so after the break, I want to get into that. And if you find yourself saying, okay, I want to read this, I want to send it maybe to some people that are anti-police, maybe even send it to some friends of mine that are in law enforcement, where they're going to go, great, I'm glad that somebody who's been in law enforcement actually telling the truth. So we're going to come back and try to give you some, if you will, intellectual ammunition, because this week you're going to hear a lot of myths about the police, and we want to try to clarify those right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then the top of the hour, we're going to be talking with our good friend Timothy Keller. Hope in Time of Fear. The next hour, Ken Starr will be with us. But this is our fourth article, Promoting Myths About Police Won't Make Us Safer. It's written by Jason Johnson. It's an article that if you know somebody in law enforcement, you might want to go to our website, pointofview.net, and maybe download it, print it off, hand it to them, or send it to them. Jason Johnson, in case you were wondering, I just mentioned a minute ago, former deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department. Now he heads up what's called the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. So again, this is something that would be an encouragement to you if you're in law enforcement. And if you are, we want to say once again, thank you for your service. If you know somebody that say, we need to defund the police, or, the police are going out there and hunting down black young people, and we need to rein them in. This is an attempt to say, wait a minute, let's just look at the statistics and recognize that there are all sorts of myths being promulgated. And I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot now as Congress considers the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And of course, we're going to have the jury selection, of course, for the police officer that led to the death of George Floyd, which I think is going to be just a circus for sure, and maybe lead to even more rioting and protesting in Minneapolis. But anyway, let's go into his piece, because he said many who rightly condemn such dangerous biases like stereotyping and generalized bias based on race and the lies they're built on make misleading claims of their own to advance other reckless bigotry, and that is anti-police bias. So he's saying, look, there are some things that people have said to justify what could be considered racism or to downplay the racial issue, and so we should condemn those. He's already said that in a longer paragraph I'm just going to skip. But now what he wants to do is focus on the myths of police. And he said, for example, on the reintroduction of this police reforming bill, the Speaker of the House, that would be Nancy Pelosi, said the epidemic of police brutality continues, with more police killings occurring last year than in the year before, with communities of color and vulnerable groups disproportionately bearing the brunt of that cruelty. Well, that sounds pretty bad. You have another report that came out, the other epidemic, fatal police shootings in a time of COVID-19, that is out there. You have Bernie Sanders saying that so you don't get shot in the back of the head. You've got the squad member, Ayanna Pressley, saying police brutality is the 6th leading cause of death of black young men. And so he first of all says, Jason Johnson says, none of these statements are fair, none of these statements are true, and none of these statements are wise, but nevertheless, they are given a lot of visibility. And then points out that if you look at the latest polls, one was an AP NOR poll, which showed that 48% of the public believes police violence against the public is extremely or very serious danger, which is up from, 32% in 2015. And he actually points out that the more liberal you are, the more likely you are to see this as a real issue, in which he points out that half of the people that identify themselves as liberal or very liberal believe that more than 1,000 or more unarmed black men are killed in the police annually. 1,000. That figure at best is at 2%, and even that one I think is inflated because of the way that is the case. And of course, when you have a narrative that says police are hunting down African Americans, black on black crime doesn't get covered. Even a black officer killing an African American individual doesn't get covered. But when it's a white police officer and an individual dies either by a shooting or in custody, then, of course, you get the attention, and so it inflates in people's minds what is taking place. He gives lots of statistics, but in the interest, I'll just give you a few, because in some respects, I encourage you to read the article in its entirety. But let's take New York City. We've used that before. Largest police force in the United States, New York Police Department, has seen police shootings decline by what? 90% in the past few decades. In 1971, for example, the New York Police Department officers fired their guns 810 times, killing 93 suspects. In 2019, for which we have the best statistics, New York's finest discharged their weapons 57 times, killing 11. Okay, this is from 810 to 57. Is that a decline? Yes. From 93 killed to 11. Is that a decline? Yes. Just an example. He has many others, but I just wanted you to see that when you hear these statements about that police shootings have gone up, Well, let's just take a couple of examples, and they've gone down precipitously. Let's take another one. Over 75% of those killed by police officers, they point out, are wielding either a gun or a knife, while most of the rest possessed other kinds of weapons. And that can be, of course, baseball bats and a variety of other things. More than twice as many whites were killed than blacks, and research shows that white officers shoot black suspects at lower rates than non-white officers. And I think that's part of what's called, if nothing else, the Ferguson effect that we've talked about with Heather McDonald. A couple more, though. When you get into this particular piece of legislation, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, it does necessarily imply defunding the police. Now, does it actually do so? No, but it leads down that road. And yet again, he points out that Americans overwhelmingly oppose defunding the police, with 73% of those polled wanting funding maintained or increase. That's 42% maintained, 31% increase. And the percentage is 55% with black Americans wishing to see funding maintained or increased, because oftentimes they are in various places which are high crime areas. And the support, he says, is for good reason. Police reduce crime, and their absence gives criminals space to wreak havoc. In 2020, homicides jumped 21% and aggravated assaults rose 8.3% as elected officials ordered police to stand down. In New York City, arrests plummeted 55% over the summer, while murder increased 45%. And similarly, in the depolicing in Chicago and Baltimore, we saw arrests fall by a quarter, while homicides spiked by 59% in Chicago, 55% in Baltimore. He, at the end, says simply, it is time to stop the falsehoods and fear-mongering. The public deserves the truth on policing. So nevertheless, I suspect we're going to hear a number of things being said about the police this week. It is certainly going to be an issue, one, because of the legislation being considered, and two, because of what is happening in Minneapolis. So in both cases, we wanted you to know that there's another side to that story, which let's hope the mainstream press covers. I have my doubts, but let's give them a chance. And then we'll talk about that even perhaps again on our Friday weekend edition as we get into some of those issues. As we wind this hour down, let me just mention again, we have Tim Keller in the next hour, Ken Starr after that. You're going to find an article on the mask mandate in Texas. Also some things on elections, making every election like 2020. We have the one about what I call the pandemic police state, which was written by Katie Pavlich, and then this one at the very end by Jason Johnson on myths about police. Next hour, I might get into another one, too. We have one on the global elite and what is going on there, but we simply are running out of time in this hour, so we encourage you to go find some of those articles. Maybe pass them on to some of your friends, neighbors, coworkers. And if you know somebody in law enforcement, maybe they'd say, I'd appreciate the fact that we're finally seeing some people getting the right information out, the right facts and figures and statistics, because we can't always depend on those people in the press covering even the police forces in a fair way. So let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk with Tim Keller right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and over the next couple of hours, we're going to cover quite a bit. Just a minute, we're going to be talking with our good friend Pastor Tim Keller about his new book, Hope in Times of Fear, the Resurrection and the Meaning of Easter. Individual that we have followed for many years and enjoyed, as we have certainly learned a great deal. But we're going to be talking about the issue of fear. I mean, he had thyroid cancer back in 2002. Of course, as many of you know, diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. But not only just the issues of him looking for hope, but also what we've been through this last year with the pandemic and the lockdown and much more. So we'll be talking with him. And I know that this will be an encouragement to you no matter where you find yourself or whatever circumstance you're in. Then we'll get into some of the issues in the news. As you may know, over the weekend, the Senate passed the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. The House is scheduled to vote on it tomorrow, and the plan is for it to pass both the House and Senate if there's any conference committee issues, so that the president, that is Joe Biden, can sign it by Sunday before some of those provisions in the previous bill actually end. We'll be getting a little bit later this hour into the whole issue of election reform. Of course, we've encouraged you to contact your two senators about For the People Act, but they're a very good piece by the Wall Street Journal, Making Every Election Like 2020, which we've posted. One on the pandemic, police state, and of course there'll be an ongoing debate about George Floyd for two reasons. Number one, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act is now in front of the House. And of course, jury selection for the police officer responsible for his death in Minneapolis. So we'll be looking at all of those issues. But let us, if we can, welcome back to the microphone Tim Keller. Timothy Keller was born in Pennsylvania. An individual graduated from Bucknell, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and Westminster Theological Seminary. Of course, was the pastor who started Redeemer Presbyterian Church. We have talked with him in the past about such books as The Reason for God, Making Sense of God, The Meaning of Marriage. This new book that is just out, 230 pages, 13 chapters, in Hope in Times of Fear, the Resurrection and Meaning of Easter, a resource that I think you're going to appreciate. And let me correct that, 12 chapters. There's actually 13 chapters in the next book I'll be talking about with Ken Starr. But if nothing else, Pastor Tim Keller, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
I'm glad to be here, and there is a 13th chapter. It's called the epilogue, so
Yes.
You weren't wrong, Kerby. I just want to make sure that you never are wrong.
No, well, that's fine. It's not numbered, so I guess I jumped ahead. By the way, we do have Ken Starr with us next hour. We're going to be talking about religious liberty in crisis. There are 13 chapters there, but the first question everybody wants me to ask is, how are you doing? That diagnosis of pancreatic cancer is certainly hard for us to hear, so how are you doing?
Yes, it's good, and I'll say in this way, I mean, spiritually, I'll be good no matter what happens, and but you know how cancer, all cancer patients or people who are close to cancer patients know that you live from scan to scan. So every 3 months you get a scan to see how the cancer is going, and you kind of live from those scans. And I've been on cancer treatment for about 10 months now, so I've had 3 scans. Every one of them showed the cancer shrinking. Now, pancreatic cancer is very deadly, and most pancreatic cancer victims die within a year and a half of 80% die within a year and a half of diagnosis. because my treatment, my cancer's responded very well, meaning it's been shrinking. And my doctors have said you're actually you're doing unusually well, which doesn't mean what it really means is that I have more time, and that's one of the prayers. The prayer is either cure it, which we do pray for that, absolutely pray for that. But God is certainly at least giving me more time than that year to 18 months. It looks like, and that's really great. So, and also I'm most of the time I feel pretty good. The chemo, as everybody knows, is pretty rough, but in my case, it's really rough for several days after the infusion, and then I'm pretty good for about 3/4 of the time. So I'm actually doing very well, and we're getting a lot of answers to prayer, too.
Wow. You start the book by talking about your thyroid cancer back in 2002 and reading, of course, The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright, who we've enjoyed having on the program many times. And there is a sense in which, whether you're going through cancer, as you were back then, and the benefit that you had of his book, or now the value of this book to put in the hands of so many listeners who may not be dealing with cancer, but could be dealing with COVID, or could just be dealing with the fact that this has just been the craziest last year that any of us have gone through. That's why you wanted to provide some people with hope. And your first chapter really gets into the idea of a certain hope, because some people, when we say, hope, I hope I'm cured, or I hope I pass this test. No, this is a certain hope that we have in the scriptures, isn't it?
Yes, and I'm glad you put your finger on that. The trouble is our English word, hope, is a pretty weak word. You use the word hope when you're not really confident. So if you say, are you confident that that's going to happen? You say, no, but I hope it will. So hope is a lower level. That's actually the Greek word that's translated hope in the Bible that the biblical writers use is a lot stronger. It really does mean confidence. I mean, in the Bible, whenever you see the word hope, this is our hope, or God is our hope, it means this is our confidence. And therefore the word is, I use the word because it's the English word we have in the Bible. And it's hope is a positive word, but it's actually a little on the weak side. And the whole idea here is if you have confidence that the resurrection happened, that's the first chapter. If you have confidence that the resurrection happened, and there's N.T. Wright gives you great reasons for believing that happened. A lot of evidence that happened. If it happened, then you know what, Kerby, everything's actually going to be okay. In the long run, everything will be okay. And that's how we start. That's the Christian hope. And it's not a hope so. It's a confidence that because Christ rose from the dead, we will too, and even the whole world someday will be put right.
And when you think about this, that was what actually drove the first century. A lot of people say, how is it, as some people said, this Jesus cult ended up, in a sense, taking over the Western civilization? And a lot of it was because if you have the hope in the resurrection, then when there is a disease, oftentimes these believers would go out in the streets and try to heal the sick. And if they would abandon a child, they would bring it into their own home because they had an eternal perspective. And so right now, when we go through some difficulties, which in this country are inconveniences, sometimes great tragedies, and then we talk about what's going overseas when people that are day laborers can't even work, in some respects, we need to come back to this idea of hope. So let me take a break because I want to give you a chance to kind of give us an overview of the book, if we can. A chapter on a certain hope, future hope, glorious hope, subversive hope. Great reversal, one on personal hope, hope for you and your relationships, hope in the face of suffering, hope for the future. 12 chapters and epilogue, and it is just out, and I think you're really going to benefit from that. And this is one that I would encourage you to read, but maybe even pass on to others who, as they read through this, it might cause them to reevaluate some of their commitments, whether they're believers or certainly even challenge the non-believers. So again, new book out by Timothy Keller, Hope in Times of Fear, the Resurrection and the Meaning of Easter. We'll come back and talk about that with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Last year, Amazon began removing books that gatekeepers felt took the wrong side of the ongoing LGBTQ debate. Some of them weren't the sort of books most small bookstores would deem to have on their shelves because of their mean-spirited tone. Then came Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. When I interviewed her on the book 3 months ago, we talked about some of the negative controversy that resulted in Target pulling the book off the shelves, but you could still buy the book on Amazon. That is no longer the case with Dr. Ryan Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. Amazon pulled the book, even though the book was released 3 years ago. Why now? Some speculate it was an inconvenient reminder of the dangers posed if Congress passed the Equality Act. If you read the book, you will find an accurate presentation of scientific, medical, and legal debates about transgenderism. Anderson currently serves as the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. It would be hard to describe him as a bomb-throwing radical, though he obviously has a viewpoint that comports with a biblical view of marriage and family. Critics of Amazon usually focus on its size and market share. There's another problem, its opacity. We still do not know who decided to ban the book or why the Amazon gatekeepers even felt the need to ban the book. Removing books from Amazon has larger implications. First, it also removes them from Amazon subsidiaries like Kindle, Audible, and A-Books. Second, it sends a signal to other bookstores not to carry the book. Here's the issue. Censorship makes it easier to maintain that there is only one side to an argument when one of the sides is no longer given a forum. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your conversation today with Dr. Timothy Keller. The book is entitled Hope in Times of Fear, The Resurrection and the Meaning of Easter. It's just now out. It should show up, if it hasn't already, in your bookstores. And again, we also have information about Tim Keller on our website, pointofview.net. Also a place, if you can't find the book, you can get it both in hardback and Kindle. And Tim Keller, for just a minute, the section on future hope, I thought that was helpful because in some respects, people don't understand when we talk about, is the kingdom of heaven now, isn't it the future? And I think you did a very good job with a diagram that I'm going to probably use in the future already, but not yet, because we used to think, and oftentimes people thought that the kingdom of God would be the old age, Messiah comes, the new age. But there's an overlap when the second coming and the first coming and the resurrection. And so explain that, if you might, because that's a source I found of confusion for some people when we talk about whether or not we're in the midst of the kingdom of God.
Yes, and it's very important for balance. If you actually just read through, say, the Gospel, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John doesn't talk about the kingdom as much. It talks about eternal life, which is the same thing. Nevertheless, if you go through first Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and see what Jesus says about the kingdom. Sometimes he talks about the kingdom of God coming right now, being at hand or in your midst, and here it is, okay? Other times he talks about the kingdom of God coming at the end of time, that when I come back, I'll come in my kingdom. And it's very confusing until you begin to realize what he means is that when he rose from the dead and ascends to the right hand of the Father, which means he's, that's enthronement, and sends the Holy Spirit, which at the end of time is going to make the entire world new. What that means is, in a sense, the kingdom of God has started, and the power of the future has come into our lives now, and it's here not fully, but partially, or another way to put it is substantially, but not fully.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, that means what's been called the kingdom of God is already, but not yet. It's here in part, but not full. And if you balance if you go too far to one side and say every time, if you just pray, no matter how sick you are, you'll always get healed, or we're going to be able to just revive the whole country immediately if everybody would just pray. That's forgetting that the kingdom of God is not yet, that it's not here in full. The world is still broken. On the other hand, if you're too pessimistic and you say, oh, those people will never become Christians, and
mm-hmm.
God never heals anybody, or nothing, if you're too pessimistic, you're forgetting the kingdom of God is here. And I think John Stott, who is a wonderful teacher,
yes, has
a number of things that helped me when I was a younger Christian to understand that like in the area of justice, you say, I want to create a more, let's just say you're a pro-life person and you want to see more justice done in that area, and you really want to not see abortion. You don't want to see as much death and so much killing of babies and in the womb and all that. Well, you know what? On the one hand, if you get involved in it, you're gonna need to know that the kingdom of God is here, but not here.
Yes,
because you're going to have to be able to realize someday justice is going to triumph. So I never have to stop. And also, I know that God is present, and we can really make some good things happen. But you also you can't be utopian, meaning
right.
we can bring in the kingdom of God now. No, sorry, not till Jesus gets back. On the other hand, you really shouldn't just say, oh, it's just terrible and it's awful and all the bad people are in charge, and we just need to get the wagons together in a circle and hold each other's hands. So that's that whole chapter, and that's about the resurrection, because when the resurrection happened, Christ, in a sense, brought the future into the present. It's wonderful.
And again, one other thing I thought while we're on the kingdom, you have a section here in the subversive hope about the upside down kingdom. I've been preaching through Matthew's in my Sunday school class, and when we go through the Gospel of Matthew, we call it the upside down kingdom, because in some respects, again, when Jesus came, it wasn't what they expected. And even to this day, we have to recognize that we're really talking about something very different, because if we're believers, we should view the world differently, shouldn't we?
Yes, because God tends to work through the weak. If you go back to Genesis, and if you've been through the book, go back to Genesis, the law of primogeniture, it was called, that you always gave the oldest son everything so he could keep the estate together. And yet, over and over and over again, the world says, you work through the older son, not the younger son. And yet God works in the life of Abel, not Cain, Isaac, not Ishmael, Jacob, not Esau. Over and over again, he changes the way things are done. And in general, Jesus didn't come back as a general. He didn't come back as a philosopher. He didn't come back as a politician. He didn't win any elections. He didn't muster any armies. He came, he died, but through weakness came strength. And so basically, in a nutshell, the way God tends to work is the way up is down. The way to become truly rich is to give away. The way to true power is to give up power in order to serve. The way to have real happiness is to seek the happiness of others more than your own. You lose your life to find it. And that's the Bible through and through. And the resurrection, death and resurrection, is the pattern.
We can talk about how people can use this book. Of course, you are very vulnerable, sharing some of your own stories, and certainly teaching great theology when we're talking about relationships and justice and suffering and a variety of others. But this is a book that is just coming out right now. People should be able to find it in the local bookstore. But I think that, first of all, it is something that will challenge us as believers. But I always love the Tim Keller books, because they're the kind of books I feel like I can hand to my unbelieving friend, whether it's things like The Reason for God or The Prodigal God or a number of others, because it resonates with them. You are writing to people that have kind of a secular mindset, aren't you?
Yes, I think that's from years of being, 32 years I've lived in Manhattan. And when before I moved to Manhattan, yeah, every other place I ever was, even Philadelphia, whenever I would preach, I knew that 99.9% of the people who were out there were already believers. But we started a different kind of church in New York, and there was always a pretty healthy number of non-believers. So it was just, Kerby, it was just, it's a habit. If you preach, I preached several times a week for years and years and years, and you always know there's non-believing people listening in. So even if I'm talking to believers, I mean, I'm opening the Bible. I mean, I'm not talking directly to non-believers. I'm talking to believers so often, but I always do it knowing I'm being overheard. If you know you're being overheard, you always, by somebody else, you're careful about what you say. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what you're perceiving. And so all my books are like that. This book is not particularly to non-believers.
No.
It's written to, I'm basically saying if you believe in the resurrection, you've got all these resources. So I'm inviting non-believers in, but it's really written more to believers. But you're right. This would be fine to give to a non-believer because that's how I write.
Well, and I think that's why when you start that first chapter about the resurrection, it sort of answers a question that maybe a lot of people have, and that is, why are you guys so fixated on this guy that died a long time ago on the cross, and you believe in the resurrection? Do you really honestly believe that somebody rose from the dead, and do you really think it's going to make a difference in my life if I believe that? And so in some respects, obviously, as you said, you're writing for believers, but at the same time, I think it's just a great opportunity for people to listen in. And so just before I let you go, let's mention again that we also have a link to timothykeller.com. And so people can find all sorts of books, resources, sermons, your blog, and other things. So what will people find when they do land on your website?
Well, everything's connected to everything else. And so you may find, first of all, if you haven't done anything else, or gotten any of my other stuff, I do ask for you to try this book. I think if it's helpful to you, then if you go back there, you'll find related material. So if you really want to say, I really like what you said about suffering in that chapter 11, I have a book on suffering. So if you really like the thing, right, you said on these other, so basically the topics you can probably find more on at that website.
And I might just mention, last time we had you with Kathy Keller on the issue of the meaning of marriage and kind of a devotional, which was something I think was very helpful as well. So we certainly appreciate you, and I just encourage all of our listeners here on Point of View to pray for you as you are going through a very difficult time with pancreatic cancer. And thank you for the testimony that you've had and the integrity of your life, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at some issues in the news. A lot of things happen in Congress right now, some key votes in the House, also some in the Senate. And by the way, while we're talking about that, if you have not taken action on one of our action items, of course, the For the People Act is in the Senate, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But we'll come back and give you an overview of some things happening this week. And then next hour, we'll be talking with Ken Starr. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
We'll spend just a little bit of time talking about what's going on in Congress, and then a half an hour from now we'll have Ken Starr with us, and he is the author of this new book, Religious Liberty in Crisis. Now, it's not out yet, but I've had a chance to read the PDF and wanted you to know about that before the book hits the bookstores, and it's really going to be, I hope, a whole hour where we can kind of do some teaching. You might want to get something to write with, and we're going to cover all sorts of different aspects of religious liberty, from, school prayer and equal access, the whole issue of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the Bladensburg Cross, Coach Kennedy, all the way down to his last chapter on the cancel culture. And I think it's very well done, and in some respects gives us kind of an overview of how we have really moved in this issue of religious liberty, what we can do to bring it back, some of the very significant successes. By the way, the book is endorsed by everybody that you can possibly imagine, Oz Guinness and Robbie George, certainly Kelly Shackelford, and a variety of others. So I think it's just going to be a great interview, so I look forward to that. But let's talk about Congress for just a minute. And that is, of course, that $1.9 trillion COVID relief package was passed 50-49. You had the one senator from Alaska not there to vote because he went back to Alaska, but otherwise it passed just again on a party line vote. Representative Dan Crenshaw is an individual I followed, and he said, no, Biden isn't a leprechaun. Again, thinking about St. Patrick. Biden isn't a leprechaun. He's just bribing you with your own money and footing your kids with the bill and some inflation to top it off. So anyway, the vote will take place in the House of Representatives tomorrow. The hope is that all the details for that will take place by Sunday or earlier, signed by the president, and then the various COVID relief package payments will head out to you. But this is so stuffed with pork and things that have not a whole lot to do with COVID-19, that it's an embarrassment. And again, when you just keep adding trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars to the national debt, it is very disturbing indeed. But we'll probably talk more about that tomorrow, because that's when the vote will take place and when we see the possible implications of that for the future. If you go to our website, you're going to see that I've posted an article by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, which they creatively entitled Making Every Election Like 2020. Having a little bit of fun at our expenses, they said, if you thought the 2020 election ran like a finely oiled machine, you'll love what the Democrats plan next. The Senate and House reserved their first bills, that is H.R. 1, which is already passed, and Senate Bill 1, which is now in front of the Senate, to actually make mail balloting in a plague year seem buttoned up. They're having a little bit of fun, and of course using about a hyperbole there. But this is a very good article that if you want to know a little bit more about why we are concerned about what has been called the For the People Act, which did pass the House, now is front of the Senate. And if you go to our website, pointofview.net, that middle column there says take action. And if you have not done so, we encourage you to take action. And that is, you just click through the material where it says take action, and then click through contact your senators. If you know what your zip code is, that's really all you need. That will pop up your two senators, and then we give you a suggested letter, and then encourage you to make any modifications you want to it, and then hit the button submit, and at least you've done your civic duty. But this article, I won't get into a lot of it, but I just wanted to let you know that I learned some things, even though I've been researching this, from this piece that came out from the Wall Street Journal. First of all, they talk about things we've mentioned before. They say H.R. 1, or this bill, is packed with provisions that will federalize election rules. They will unsettle long-standing practices and security measures that local officials think prudent, undermine public confidence, and also increase the odds of contested outcomes. They said it would create a federal right to a mail-in ballot, no excuse necessary. Registered voters couldn't be made to submit any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot, except a signature or an affirmation. State laws requiring mail ballots to be notarized or signed by witnesses would be removed. Late arriving ballots, if postmarked on time, would be valid nationwide for 10 days after the election day. Oh, what could possibly go wrong? Then H.R. 1 would overrule state laws against ballot harvesting. There are some states, some of you in California know that exists there, but there are other places where when ballot harvesting took place, I'll use North Carolina as a good example, they had to rerun a congressional race because of that. It would let Americans nationwide designate any person to return a vote, provided the carrier does not receive any form of compensation based on the number of ballots. Also, the states could not put a limit on the number of absentee ballots that they could collect and return. Oh, my goodness. What could go wrong there? Under H.R. 1, same-day voter registration and 15 days of early voting would both be mandatory. Under H.R. 1, this is one that's interesting, felons would be allowed to vote. Now, they couldn't if they were in prison, but they could vote if they were felons, which, again, changes all sorts of laws. And what was surprising to me is tucked away in this 800-page bill are a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily think have anything to do with elections. Of course, that's the way some of these bills are put together anyway. But one aspect of this is that H.R. 1 would require the judiciary to create a code of conduct for Supreme Court justices. And the implications of this is that this could be a tactic of then filing what are called ethics complaints and then use that to force jurists to recuse themselves from that particular case. And the reason they do that, I suspect, is if you go back 20 years ago, in the 2000 election, you had a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, Gore versus Bush. And you had the Supreme Court rule, well, if you could recuse Clarence Thomas, for example, and others, then you could guarantee the outcome. So even in the midst of this 800-page bill are some things which at first blush don't even look like they have anything to do with elections, but I think, again, is an attempt in the future to make sure that even if there was some kind of electoral irregularities, as we like to call it around here, that you could make sure that you get the prescribed outcome from the Supreme Court. Isn't that amazing? Well, anyway, that's one of the articles we've posted here. But I thought just before we take a break, I would quote from another one by Katie Pavlich. It's entitled, "A Pandemic Police State for You While Illegal Aliens Go Free." She says, last summer I flew to Montana ahead of a week-long road trip through Yellowstone and Teton National Park. Boy, I'd love to do that. When I landed at the airport in Bozeman, that'd be in Bozeman, Montana, I've been there before, I was greeted by National Guard troops. After scanning my driver's license, taking my temperature, and answering a few questions, they allowed me to move along to baggage claim in my rental car. In Washington, D.C. that same summer, I received text messages from a friend walking along the river. He saw National Guard troops ensuring that people don't even sit on benches, giving order to pedestrians who weren't properly socially distanced. And a few months later, when I traveled to New York City for work, police officers met the passengers of the train at the top of the escalator at Penn Station and directed us to a table. We were forced to fill out paperwork about where we were staying, where we were from, and contact information. We were reminded of the mandatory 14-day quarantine period after traveling from out of state, threatened with hefty fines or jail for violations, and told a law enforcement official could show up at the address provided in order to ensure compliance. All of this, she says, was unsettling. The implementation of a police state for American citizens was done in the name of preventing the spread of the coronavirus. But now, 1 year from the pandemic and under a new president, we're learning the Biden administration is allowing hundreds of illegal aliens who have tested positive for the disease to travel freely around America. She gives that number that I gave you from Brownsville, where they actually tested. It's one of the few times we've done this for people that have come here illegally, and they found that they had 108 people that tested positive, or about 6.3%. Well, again, that was just a small sample. As you may have heard me point out the other day, we have had on one day just recently 6,000 people cross the border. So multiply 6% or almost 7%. I think that number's probably low, by the way, because there'll probably be some others that were asymptomatic at the time. And multiply that by 6,000 each day, and you recognize that we are creating a super spreader event now in our southern states, because those people then go out into the general public. And she points out, we haven't been allowed to visit family members. We've had travel restrictions. Grandparents oftentimes have been in solitary confinement. People have been threatened with fines and jail. And now we're finding out that we have no interest on the part of this administration in applying the health standards that they expect us to follow to those people that are here illegally crossing the border. I've summarized, of course, a 2-page commentary very briefly, but you might want to read it because it illustrates again how in some respects we have a pandemic police state while illegal aliens go free. We'll be right back after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View
your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we want to, for just a few minutes, encourage those of you that are in law enforcement. And if you know somebody that is, you may want to even get this article that we have posted here. Promoting myths about police won't make us safer. This is going to be a kind of a difficult couple of weeks for some of you that are first responders for a couple of issues. First of all, Congress right now in the House of Representatives is considering what's called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021. So you're going to hear some statements being made about the police, maybe some calling for defunding the police, others saying that they are engaged in all sorts of police brutality. I'm going to give you a quote from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, in that regard, and much, much more. And while that piece of legislation is being considered, of course, if you've been paying any attention, you know that the law enforcement officer, the police officer responsible for the death of George Floyd, will be on trial, and so that is going to be front and center in Minneapolis. And so this is a piece that I would encourage you to read in its entirety. We only have a few minutes, so I'm going to summarize it, but I would hope that you would go to our website and find this article by Jason Johnson. You might say, okay, who is he? Well, he's the former deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department. He now also is the head of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. And the piece is entitled, Promoting Myths About Police Won't Make Us Safer. First of all, we want to say we appreciate those of you in law enforcement, and we recognize that every once in a while there's a bad apple and they can make the whole barrel look bad. But again, one of the things that this particular author, Jason Johnson, points out is that there have been, in some cases, some dangerous biases that people have had about race. So let's start with the obvious. Sometimes people are biased about race or maybe have some stereotypes that are not accurate, and that is certainly the case. But then he dismisses that quickly to get to the big issue, and that is there are also a lot of biases and stereotypes about what he calls an anti-police bias. I can give you lots of examples, but I won't do too many. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, said the epidemic of police brutality continues with more police killings occurring last year than the year before, and communities of color and vulnerable groups disproportionately bearing the brunt of this cruelty. You have reports coming out about an epidemic of police shootings. Bernie Sanders says that you warned a questioner to respect the police so you don't get shot in the back of the head. Well, that was real helpful. One of the squad members said police brutality is the sixth leading cause of death for young black men. That's just a couple of the quotes. And again, to his credit, Jason Johnson points out that none of these statements are fair. None of these statements are true. None of these statements are wise. Yet the sad reality is the most recent poll done by the Associated Press with a couple of other groups show that 48% of the public believe that police violence against the public is either an extremely dangerous problem or a very serious problem. That's up even from 32% just a few years ago. And what you find is the more liberal the individual being polled, the more radical some of their views are. They found that half of the people that identify themselves either as liberal or very liberal believe that at least 1,000 or more unarmed black men are killed every year. No, that's not even in the right order of magnitude. And so, again, you might say, okay, well, then I want to see some statistics about that. Of course, we've done this before. We've had people like Heather McDonald on. But, again, let's give Jason Johnson credit. I'll just pick a few in the interest of time. The largest police force in the United States, New York Police Department, and they have seen police shootings decline by 90%. Let's compare, for example, 1971. New York Police Department officers fired their guns 810 times, killing 93 suspects. But in 2019, for which we have some of the best statistics so far, New York's finest discharged their weapons 57 times, killing 11. So the difference between 810 and 57, that's a precipitous drop, isn't it? From 93 suspects killed to 11. Do you see the point that he's trying to make? He goes on to some other issues as well. Over 75% of those killed by police in many cases were wielding a gun or a knife or some other weapon. And research shows that white officers shoot black suspects at lower rates than non-white officers, which I think gets back to something we've talked about before, the so-called Ferguson effect. But even in the midst of this, even though we are going to be be hearing a lot about the George Floyd Justice and Police Act of 2021, most Americans still believe the police need to perform their function. Americans overwhelmingly, he points out, oppose defunding the police. 73% of those wanted either maintaining it or increasing the funding. Even black Americans at 55%. And he says the support is for good reason. Police reduce crime, and their absence in a community allows criminals space to wreak havoc. And points out in New York City, for example, when arrests plummeted 55% over the summer, murder increased 45%. Same thing happened in Chicago and Baltimore. Again, when arrests fell by about a quarter in Chicago and Baltimore, homicides spiked 59% in Chicago, 55% in Baltimore. He goes through a very long set of facts and figures, and if nothing else, ends by saying it's time to stop the falsehoods and fear-mongering. The public deserves the truth in policing. But I wanted to prepare you for this because what you're going to find are a lot of facts and figures thrown around, a lot of information missing, a lot of rhetoric that is going to surface because of course, the trial that will be taking place in Minneapolis, as well as because of some of the things that will be said as this particular piece of legislation is being considered. So I just wanted you to have access to this. And if you know somebody in law enforcement, you might want to pass it on to them. If you have somebody who's absolutely convinced that the answer to our problem with policing in America is to defund the police, you might pass this on to them. And it's a resource I wanted to put in your hands, especially since I'm kind of anticipating what's going to unfold over the next couple of weeks as we talk about law enforcement and, of course, racial tensions in America. Just before we take a break and we spend some time learning from Ken Starr, let me also mention that we've got a very good piece here by Jeff Davidson. What drives the global elite on their maniacal mission? And he talks about some of the lockdowns and those kinds of things and all sorts of attempts to really move through and push through some questionable legislation. And then in the second page, he also points out that if all of this leads to the decline of America, he then points out that there are global elites that believe that they can move themselves and our country closer and closer to their goal of a one world government. And he goes into some detail about, these global elites. It's not something we've talked about too often, but we will probably get back to as well. And I just wanted you to know that that is an article, even though I didn't cover it here today, is available for you to read in its entirety. And if nothing else, I would encourage you to look at some of these articles we've posted, one about the election, one about the pandemic, one about the issue of law enforcement and crime, and one about global elites. And those are available at our website, pointofview.net. But as we wind down this hour, let me just mention, first of all, my Viewpoints commentary today is about transgenderism and about the decision to ban the book by Dr. Ryan Anderson, When Harry Became Sally, and some of the issues associated with that, something we've talked about before. And our Take Action item, which is there in the middle for the People Act, is an opportunity one more time before we move on to some of these other issues for you to contact your 2 United States senators about this so-called election reform. And I love what our friends at the Wall Street Journal said. If you think the 2020 election ran like a finely oiled machine, well, then I guess you're going to be excited about this particular piece of legislation. If you think we've had a few election irregularities, you don't want to pass that, and you might even encourage your local state legislature to firm up some of those rules. We come back, though, we're going to talk with Ken Starr about religious liberty in crisis right after these messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to focus on the subject of religious liberty, which we do so often on our weekend edition with Kelly Shackelford and other people with First Liberty. But this is going to be an hour in which we're going to spend some time maybe giving you the whole scope of what is taking place, because there is this book coming out next month, about mid-April, Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. It is written by Judge Ken Starr. It has endorsements from all sorts of individuals that have been on this program, like Oz Guinness and Robert George and Kelly Shackelford and Charlie Kirk and Max Lucado, to mention just a few. And so we are going to cover all sorts of issues, from such things as maybe school prayer and equal access to homeschooling, the Bladensburg Cross and Coach Kennedy, even the issues of the Lemon Test and abortion, all the way down to even the rise of the cancel culture. 13 chapters in this book, which I think you're going to really benefit from. And they're written by Judge Ken Starr, who's had a distinguished career in the academy as well as in law and public service. You know him as an individual that, first of all, was involved in the independent counsel for so many different investigations, served as a circuit court justice. Interestingly enough, has argued 36 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. He also, of course, was dean of Pepperdine School of Law, the president and chancellor of Baylor University, a graduate of George Washington University with a master's degree from Brown University, a law degree from Duke University Law School. And Judge Ken Starr, always a delight to have you on the program.
Oh, thank you, Kerby. It's an honor and privilege and a blessing to be with you. Thank you.
Kenny, again, we've been talking about this. Kelly Shackelford said to say hello, and of course, we so appreciate the work that you've done over these years. And of course, he and many other people have endorsed the book. I got it on PDF, and I've looked at every single page, and I'm going to see if we can cover all of the waterfront here. But right off the bat, you get into how, in some respects, this COVID pandemic and the lockdowns have caused us to really kind of reevaluate what we give to Caesar and what we don't. You know, in the book of Matthew, matter of fact, I'm teaching through the book of Matthew right now. It talks about render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render unto God the things that are God's. And in the first chapter, you say, hands off Caesar. Tell us more, if you might.
Yes, well, thank you again. Yes, the pandemic brought to life the fact that government can be our friend, but at the same time, government supposedly looking out for us, looking out for our health, the public health, and so forth, can sometimes make really wrong steps or overstep. And I think that is what happened during the high water mark, or perhaps the low water mark, of the pandemic, with governors around the country, happily not our own governor, just saying churches should either be closed or nigh unto closed. And the example that I use, which I think puts everything in kind of sharp, bold relief, is the governor of Nevada essentially saying Caesar's Palace and other casinos can operate at 1/2 capacity, but churches are limited no matter how large the sanctuary, the auditorium, the place of worship may be, may have a maximum of 50. Blatant discrimination against church services, religious gatherings, and my view is, hey, we've got to be able to identify we can't just say, hey, that's wrong as a matter of common sense. That's wrong for the reasons that Kelly Shackelford and First Liberty can say, let's go into court and do that. We all, it seems to me, need to be aware of what our rights are under America's Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but especially the First Amendment. And that's what this book is all about.
Well, and again, we broadcast in about 36 different states, and our friends up in the Northeast, our friends in California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, for example, have certainly faced some of this. And so there has been kind of a patchwork quilt of some places where church attendance has been allowed. But again, if I had even told you this time a year ago that there would be no Easter services in any church and that there would be individuals sometimes meeting people as they get off of airplanes or off of trains, wanting to know where they're going, telling them that they have to fill out these forms, they have to quarantine themselves, and that somebody might even show up at that address to make sure that they are there, and they would be struck with fines, maybe imprisonment. I think you would want me to maybe check into a place that has a rubber room, but that's exactly what's unfolded this year, right?
It is excessive regulation. There's common sense public health regulation, and then there's excessive regulation. And so how do we draw the line? But what's the principle or the basis for drawing that line? And one of the things that this book tries to accomplish is to give people a way of thinking and then speaking about their religious faith and exercising their religious faith. It's not just, we're talking about that now, freedom to worship, but it's also the freedom to exercise your faith. And that is such a foundational right to people of faith, to the household of believers, to the community of believers, but it should be important to every American who loves our sweet land of liberty and our culture of freedom. That should be what unifies us, but no longer. The idea of exercising religious faith has become, as you well know, a very key point of division.
It certainly is. One of the things you talk about in the second chapter, Faith of Our Fathers, it's the Bladensburg Cross, which would be very familiar to our listeners, because how many times has Kelly Shackelford or one of his attorneys been here? But this is a case that went to the Supreme Court that simply said, look, putting up a cross to honor those individuals that died in World War I, we shouldn't have to tear down the cross, or we shouldn't do what one judge said, well, why don't we just cut off the arms of the cross? Then it wouldn't be offensive. Well, I think it would be offensive to us. And so, again, some of these issues have had to make their way all the way to the Supreme Court, haven't they?
Yes, so many judges, unfortunately, have lost their way when it comes to interpreting those precious first 16 words of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I hope every American who loves liberty, especially friends of religious liberty, will commit like a Bible verse to memory, because it's our secular way of saying to those who don't believe, and especially those who are hostile to religious belief and the exercise of faith, we have a constitutional right to do what we're doing. So, yes, unfortunately, the Court of Appeals in Richmond, in the Bladensburg Cross case, that Kelly's group and Kelly brilliantly lawyered that, and let's give thanks for, again, the work of Kelly Shackelford and First Liberty. I certainly do. Yes, let's cut the arms off, and that way the American Humanist Association will no longer take offense. And that position in the Supreme Court of the United States was rejected 7-2, not 5-4. I wish it had been 9-0.
Me too.
But it was 7-2.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some more of this, because we got everything from homeschooling to school prayer, free exercise, equal access, lemon test. We're got a lot to cover, and so sit down, take some notes. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Last year, Amazon began removing books that gatekeepers felt took the wrong side of the ongoing LGBTQ debate. Some of them weren't the sort of books most small bookstores would deem to have on their shelves because of their mean-spirited tone. Then came Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. When I interviewed her on the book 3 months ago, we talked about some of the negative controversy that resulted in Target pulling the book off the shelves, but you could still buy the book on Amazon. That is no longer the case with Dr. Ryan Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. Amazon pulled the book, even though the book was released 3 years ago. Why now? Some speculate it was an inconvenient reminder of the dangers posed if Congress passed the Equality Act. If you read the book, you will find an accurate presentation of scientific, medical, and legal debates about transgenderism. Anderson currently serves as the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. It would be hard to describe him as a bomb-throwing radical, though he obviously has a viewpoint that comports with a biblical view of marriage and family. Critics of Amazon usually focus on its size and market share. There's another problem, its opacity. We still do not know who decided to ban the book or why the Amazon gatekeepers even felt the need to ban the book. Removing books from Amazon has larger implications. First, it also removes them from Amazon subsidiaries like Kindle, Audible, and A-Books. Second, it sends a signal to other bookstores not to carry the book. Here's the issue. Censorship makes it easier to maintain that there is only one side to an argument when one of the sides is no longer given a forum. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, as we talk about religious liberty in crisis, exercising your faith in an age of uncertainty, coming out in April, and we are talking with Judge Ken Starr. And I thought we might, if we could, focus on one of the chapters there called Free to Believe, because it gets us into a couple of issues. Number one, this idea of a freedom of conscience, and then a little bit later gets into another issue, the right of homeschooling. But the idea of free of conscience, there is a very important principle that has existed that says you actually do provide an opportunity for someone who maybe would be a conscientious objector, or if you are like the Jehovah's Witnesses, cannot say the Pledge of Allegiance or something of that nature. We provide that freedom, and as you talk about later in your last chapter, cancel culture, that's going away. But we used to believe in the idea that you have religious freedom, even the freedom of conscience, and that was something that was foundational to this country, wasn't it?
Oh, it was so critically important. And even during the Revolutionary War, all of the future states, the colonies in rebellion, recognized conscientious objection. Isn't that wonderful? People fighting for their lives and their liberties, and the enemy troops were on the ground, right? They were on American soil. So the stakes were pretty high, and yet we recognize the freedom of individuals to believe and to act on that belief. And then in the Constitution itself, we build in the objection and provide for the objection that someone does not want to take an oath, right? Taking the biblical admonition very, very textually and literally.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the Constitution itself, the president and other officials, judges, are to take an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. We love that oath, right? And you take this oath freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. Those are the words of the oath of office that the president, the judges take. But guess what? The text of the Constitution provides a parenthetical exit ramp. I do solemnly swear or affirm. If you can't swear, isn't that great? That's in the text of the Constitution. It's just in the spirit of our culture, but it's also very constitutionally based. And then happily, in so many decisions over the decades, the Supreme Court of the United States has been very assiduous in protecting the freedom of exercise of conscience. But, my friends, that is changing.
Yes.
Right? Think of Jack Phillips, the wonderful human being who's about to go on trial for yet another part of this marathon ordeal that he's suffering at Masterpiece Cake Shop. Because even though he will serve anyone and everyone, and he will serve anyone and everyone in a loving and kind way in his beautiful cake shop in suburban Denver, Colorado, and Lakewood, Colorado, he cannot in conscience as a cake artist, and I'm sure your listeners know about this, create certain kinds of cakes that reflect an institution or an activity that is inimical to his conscience. For example, he will not do a Halloween cake. He views that as demonic. And so he cannot in conscience create a cake in celebration of a divorce or of a same-sex marriage. And we used to protect that. Well, all right, you can go to the next cake shop, right? You might prefer his artistry because he is an extraordinary artist, but we protect that no longer. And so happily in many states, it's protected. In my home state of Texas, my native state, where I'm very blessed to continue to live, that kind of action would be protected, but not in Colorado and in so many states where your listeners find themselves.
And again, that's why the book is entitled Religious Liberty in Crisis. While we're talking about conscience, let's talk about homeschooling for just a minute. You have a whole section there on the religious right to homeschool. There are some very concerning pieces of legislation, one in the state of Oregon and some other places right now that may significantly affect homeschooling, but that fits into this idea of right of conscience, doesn't it? Because we do believe that we should have educated individuals, but they don't necessarily have to be educated in the public schools. And so we've had a number of rulings that have affirmed the idea of homeschooling, don't we?
Yes, and as it stands now, pardon me, homeschooling is permitted in all 50 states. And that is what our friend Mike Ferris, who led this effort, was a co-leader of this effort, called a true generational change. And it's a generational change in favor of liberty. And of course, the pandemic has caused an explosion, right, Kerby? And the number of families have said, gosh, I think I want my children to actually be educated, and I can control the education. I have to work now out of my house or whatever. And so we've seen now, the estimate I last saw, you probably have better estimates, is 10% of America's school children are now being homeschooled.
Yes.
This is a fundamental right of parents, and it is grounded in the fundamental idea of liberty of parents to guide the rearing of their children, including, within reason, the education of their children. Now, education can be regulated by the state. We're not talking about a libertarian vision of I can teach them anything I want to or teach them nothing at all. No, there can be regulations, but the idea is consistent then, and there's so many wonderful programs, as you know, out to guide parents, grandparents, to engage in homeschooling. And I'll tell you this, both at Baylor, where I was blessed to serve as president, then as president and chancellor, the homeschooling kids did great.
Yes.
They just performed beautifully. And they also had an anchor in faith. Most also had an anchor in that which so many public school systems are not emphasizing, and that is civic education, the history of our country, including religious freedom.
Let's, if we can, talk about some of the issues of school, since we got into that. Chapter 4 deals with, of course, the whole battle over school prayer, Engel, Abington, and those kinds of things. But then Chapter 5 also, the so-called Mergens case, equal access. It seems to me that maybe we'll pick the last one first, that if you, in a high school, are allowed to have a chess club or a debate club or a ski club, then you should also have a Bible club, and that's what the Equal Access Act was all about. But then you had to take a case all the way to the Supreme Court in order to have the court rule in favor. Can you give us some background on that?
Yes, Bridget Mergens, God bless her, a sophomore in suburban Omaha, Nebraska, years ago, wanted to start a Bible study club at her very large public high school, and the authorities said no, and they had very bad legal advice, and it's just hard for me 30 years later to understand how could they have gotten it so wrong, they being the school authorities. But the issue went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held 8-1, I wish it would have been 9-0, that Bridget Mergens had that right to start her Bible study club, and that it was a violation of the federal law and the federal Constitution to keep Bridget from having a club, just as, say, her best friend wanted to start a chess club. God bless her, start your chess club, right? The school allowed that. But they discriminated, that's the key word, they discriminated against religious clubs, and specifically her open Bible study club. Now, you might say, well, wait a second. Would Bridget have the right, as, let's say, founder president of the club, to exclude students who wanted to join the club who might be agnostic or even atheist? No, the school can regulate and say, Bridget, you've got to permit everybody to come in who wants to come in. I know that can be a delicate issue at times, but she was saying, we're going to welcome everyone. We're not putting out a not welcome sign for anyone. It's just the school authorities had such a benighted and wrong-headed view that they had to separate church and state. We want the church to be separate from the state, but we don't want this kind of discrimination by the state against the church and church-related or religiously affiliated groups.
Let's take a break. And one of the things I so enjoy about this book is not only does it give you some of these facts, but in many cases, as you can probably pick up, Judge Ken Starr was involved in many of these cases as a solicitor general or as an individual that argued a case before the Supreme Court in one way or another, or was involved with it, or knows some of the people. So it adds some personalities to some of the things that we talk about here on Point of View. So let's take a break. When we come back, let's get into the other aspect of this. You've been talking about the establishment of religion. What about the free exercise of religion? And that's important. But we'll also maybe get into what we've talked about, the lemon test, and maybe even the Smith test and a few of the others, and some of the other cases that he has argued. And it's all part of his book that will be coming out in the middle of April, Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. Judge Ken Starr with us. We have information about him, information about this book that you might want to pre-order, and eventually, of course, it will show up in your bookstore. But if you want to get it in hardback or Kindle, there's a way you can order it there as well. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to talk about in terms of religious liberty right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today Judge Ken Starr as we talk about his book, Religious Liberty in Crisis, 13 chapters, and we've made our way to chapter 6. We may not get all of them, but we'll do our best. But chapter 6 is important because, Judge Starr, when we talk about the First Amendment, almost everybody camps out on the Establishment Clause and ignores the Free Exercise Clause, and I would have to say that part of it, as you described there, is was due to a decision that came out of Oregon, and it had to do with peyote, and it had to do with religious exercise, and it had to do with, it's hard to admit this, but Justice Scalia, I think, voted wrong on that and led ultimately to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But most of the time now we hear about cases involving the establishment of religion, but there's another part of that, and that is we're supposed to have the free exercise of religion. But that case that came down out of Oregon from the Supreme Court has really prevented many of those cases from being argued in that way. Can you explain that?
Yes, this is where Justice Scalia did, with all due respect, get it profoundly wrong. The rule that he articulated in the Oregon peyote case called Employment Division versus Smith was this: if a law passed by a legislature, by Congress, but typically we're talking about a state law or maybe a local ordinance, is a law of general applicability, that is, it's not targeted at religion, right? We're not trying to target this particular religious community to show preferential treatment over here or detrimental treatment over there. As long as the law is general applicability, it applies to everyone, and is neutral in its terms, it's not talking about religious faith, then if an individual on grounds of free exercise says, I would like a religious freedom exception to that, that person loses the case. Terrible. It brought about a constitutional revolution, a revolution, and honor to whom honor is due, that occurred during the Warren Court era. Yes, the Warren Court era ushered in an era of very carefully reviewing and striking down laws that did not permit the kind of exception for religious believers that those Native Americans in Employment Division versus Smith were seeking from Oregon's drug laws. Now, we might say no one needs a peyote exception, but it was undisputed that peyote in that case was used by the Native American church as part of its sacraments. So the question is, can we recognize that? And the Scalia said, no, you've got to go to your state legislature and try to get a legislative exemption. Well, that might have worked once upon a time, but welcome to the 21st century. You see, that decision was 31 years ago, and the culture has shifted, and now we need that succor and comfort and refuge of the Warren Court approach, which the Religious Freedom Restoration Act restored. Restoration, namely that if government is going to step in and to prevent someone from exercising his or her free exercise rights, then the government has to come forward, and we call it strict scrutiny. That means it's going to be really hard for the government to justify denying that person that exception to the generally applicable law that he or she is seeking. Now, that's a mouthful. What it really boils down to is Employment Division versus Smith, authored by Justice Scalia, it constitutes a continual, clear, and present danger to exemptions from generally applicable laws for free exercise conscientious objectors. So it's terrible. Happily, it's before the Supreme Court of the United States now in a case involving the refusal of Philadelphia to permit Catholic social services to continue to render their foster child placement services, refusing to create an exception from Philadelphia's very recent policy with respect to LGBTQ couples, even though no LGBTQ couple had ever applied to Catholic social services in Philadelphia. They're excluded, no exceptions. So the Supreme Court now has that before them.
Well, and again, those are the other kinds of cases. One of those Kelly Shackelford talks about is Coach Kennedy, that after the game, while people are leaving the stands, he goes to the 50-yard line to pray, and he's told that if somebody even sees a coach after the game praying, that would be an unconstitutional establishment of religion, and his free exercise doesn't apply. But it seems to me that maybe eventually some of these issues of free exercise will be resolved, as we saw, I think, with the Bladensburg case, because if you go back to the other part of that very important clause, the Establishment Clause, back in 1971, as you point out in one of the chapters in your book, in a case involving what's called the Lemon case, they established so many kinds of rules and I think unconstitutional categories that it made it difficult for any kind of religious liberty. And it seems to me the Supreme Court in the case with Bladensburg has kind of set aside that Lemon test. What are your thoughts?
Yes, we are coming out of the wilderness created, unfortunately, by the Supreme Court in 1971 with a simple three-part test to determine whether a particular law, ordinance, rule pass constitutional muster. And that is asking three questions. What's the primary purpose of that law? Is it to advance religion or is it to inhibit religion? What's then the primary effect of that law? And then the final part of the test is, does the law or ordinance create what is called an excessive entanglement between church and state? Now, the rule sounds pretty, well, that seems sensible. The government shouldn't be in the business of trying to be out there promoting religious faith. Some might say the so-called law of neutrality. We can argue that, by the way. The first Congress would have argued that. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, repassed in 1789, the first Congress said, this is the law of the land. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. But, okay, let's just say, well, that was then. I happen to think that they were really on to something and that those words should be heeded today. Here's the reason the test doesn't work. Think about Congress in 1954 adding the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. What's the primary purpose of that? Is that totally neutral toward religious faith and doctrine? I wouldn't think so. What's the purpose of the National Day of Prayer? What's the primary purpose? And you start testing the test, and the test starts being a Death Star right out of Star Wars. It starts killing these different kinds of practices and traditions. And thank goodness, we're so thankful that the Supreme Court no longer embraces this three-part Death Star test called the Lemon test, appropriate, very bitter. You might like lemonade, but this is not lemonade. This is bitter lemon. And the Supreme Court is definitely moving away. They haven't officially overruled it, but it's definitely moving away from it, including, as you rightly indicate, in Kelly Shackelford's wonderful triumph by God's grace in the Bladensburg case.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, certainly want to focus on a case that you argued before the Supreme Court where you said Roe versus Wade should be overturned, overruled, and here you have 9 justices listening to you on that, and that has to do with the issue of abortion. And then also, before we end, of course, one of the chapters on the rise of the cancel culture, because today we no longer want to accommodate religious faith, we want to remove it. And it seems to me sometimes that whenever there's a conflict between LGBTQ and religious liberty, LGBTQ wins and religious liberty loses. So this is all part of this book, Religious Liberty in Crisis. If you find yourself saying, well, he's quite a scholar, so I'm not sure I could understand this book, I would certainly hasten to say that you will find it very readable. One of the gifts that not not only does Kelly Shackelford have, but Ken Starr has, they're great storytellers. And so in some cases, he said, now hold on, if you're not a lawyer, and then he goes on and explains something, you go, okay, I get it. That works pretty well. 13 chapters dealing with all sorts of issues ranging from school prayer and free exercise, the establishment of religion. We'll come back to this issue of abortion and much more, and ending up with, of course, some of the concerns and why we are a bit at a crisis in terms of religious liberty. Judge Ken Starr with us, and we'll continue our conversation with him right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Religious liberty in crisis, exercising your faith in an age of uncertainty. Judge Ken Starr with us. And Judge, let me, Ken, put you in front of 9 Supreme Court justices many years ago in which you said Roe v. Wade should be overruled. Roe was wrongly decided, and it has been unsparingly criticized over the years for the weaknesses of its legal reasoning. What about that particular case? And, of course, that gets us into Roe versus Wade and Casey and some of these other cases, because in some respects, it is a classic example of judicial overreach, isn't it?
I think so. Roe v. Wade was, in fact, wrongly decided. It was decided on the basis of what is called substantive due process, that a woman's right to choose, as long as she is doing so in consultation with a licensed physician, is constitutionally protected. That was, with all respect to the Supreme Court at the time, in 1973, entirely made up. It's simply not grounded. That ruling is not grounded in the text, the structure, or the history of the Constitution. And there's a pretty good test. You say, well, that's your view, and maybe listeners agree with that, but what's wrong with the view? Well, that very logic was used some few years later, Kerby, as you know, to purportedly justify the right to physician-assisted suicide.
Yes.
Using the logic and the holding of Roe versus Wade. But the Supreme Court of the United States unanimously rejected the argument that Roe's logic extended to include the individual's decision to terminate his or her own life. Whereas, of course, abortion raises, as we all know, the extraordinarily sensitive, almost unspeakably difficult, the life of a precious unborn child, right? That's not an issue in physician-assisted suicide. And the Supreme Court came back from the brink and got back, I think, on the track of allowing the democratic process to work through reasoned debate and so forth. So it was a terrible decision. So we urged the Supreme Court. I was arguing that in the Supreme Court in President Bush 41's tenure. And unfortunately, 3 members of the court came up with a theory which carries the day to this day, that stare decisis, the idea is the past rules the present, that we have to follow the precedent of Roe v. Wade, save for the most compelling reasons. Well, I think those reasons did exist, but the idea of precedent and stare decisis, Latin for stay the course, we've decided, stick with it, carried the day. And so Roe v. Wade continues to be, albeit it was modified by Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and the rigid trimester framework of Roe v. Wade was overruled, but nonetheless, the so-called core holding of Roe v. Wade was affirmed, and that was a huge setback, I think, not only for just those who believe in the sanctity of life, which is enormously important, but also for just those who believe that the Constitution is a way for us to resolve these kinds of issues in democratic debate and discourse.
Just before we run out of time, the last chapter is the rise of the cancel culture. And some people might say, well, you've been talking about Supreme Court precedents and you've been talking about religious liberty. How does that fit? But it fits only so well because if indeed you do not protect the rights of conscience, the rights of free speech, the rights of religious expression, then you find yourself in the world that we're in right now, which is a cancel culture, don't you?
Absolutely, and the Supreme Court has before it, and let's prayerfully hope for the right kind of decision, of a young convert to Christianity, a wonderful African-American, a beautiful Nigerian name, convert to Christianity, is holding forth, evangelizing on his college campus, a public campus in Georgia, and he's told, you can't do that. And you've got to come over here to Speaker's Corner. So he goes over to Speaker's Corner, and then he's told, you can't do that because someone just reported that they took offense in what you said. That's cancel culture. And happily, this is where the Kelly Shackelfords are so important, Kerby. He was represented by able counsel here, the Alliance Defense Firm, and the college has changed its policy, but we're seeing this all around the country. That's why we need groups like First Liberty, Alliance Defending Freedom, and so forth, saying, no, you are trenching on fundamental constitutional rights. You can't do that. So we have tools to fight back against the cancel culture. That's the good news that I'm trying to bring forward in this book.
Well, I think you've done such a great job because, again, exercising your faith in an age of uncertainty is the subtitle. And it's about 200 pages, and it's very easy read. Again, as I've said before, some people might say, well, you're an eminent scholar and you've argued all these cases before the Supreme Court. You were a circuit judge. You were the dean of a law school, president, chancellor of a university. Am I going to be able to read the book? And you're just a great storyteller. And if if nothing else, I think people will find that this might be a very good, if you will, education in the whole range of religious liberty. And one of the other chapters talks about the fruits of religious liberty, because if you think about this, I say this sometimes when I'm talking even to atheists, you may not really care about my religious liberty because you say, well, I'm not religious. But if you lose in this country religious liberty, guess what, Mr. Atheist? You're going to lose your liberty too. We have seen this unfold in other totalitarian countries. So even though you may not necessarily care about my religious liberty, you probably do care about your own liberty, and that's why you need to pay attention. So there are some tremendous fruits of religious liberty, not to mention just the freedom that this has provided for churches and Christian organizations, not only in this country but around the world, to do the work of the gospel and to do great social service. So, Judge Ken Starr, it is always a delight to have you on the program. I am thrilled with the book, and I had a chance to get a chance to read it ahead of time, but I encourage some of our listeners to be looking for it when it comes out and to read it and to learn a little bit more. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. It's been a real blessing to be with you.
Let's, if we can, just before we run out of time, mention again that the book is entitled Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. It'll come back in April, and so you can be looking for it then. Of course, you can pre-order it, and we have information about that, so you can get it in hardcover or Kindle. It looks at all the issues. It does not shy away from the fact that because of the COVID and pandemic lockdowns, we've lost some of our liberty. It looks at some of the victories, which we've talked about today, the Bladensburg case and the Mergens case on equal access. It looks at why religious liberty is important. If you are a homeschooler, you need to pay attention to that. It looks at some of these cases that were wrongly decided, and we just looked at one of those, the not only Roe versus Wade, but then even the Casey decision out of Pennsylvania, which went the wrong direction, and also takes on some of these other important issues like, accommodation of religious ideas and what could be allowed in the future and what is going to be the future for religious liberty, even under this new administration. I think so highly of this. Hopefully we will play this interview again. I'm thinking maybe we'll even make a CD available for individuals, maybe even put it together for our Truth Team material, because I think you need to understand this, and he has done such a great job of writing the book, and I think we've all enjoyed the 1 hour with Judge Ken Starr. You know, he's just plain folks. You got to love it. Quite a storyteller and an individual who has been personally involved in so many of these cases. It's been fun to have him reflect on that, not only from a legal point of view, but even from his own personal experience. So one last time, the book is entitled Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty, coming out in April, and you've been listening to Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all